Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk Mental Health Trumbull. I will introduce our first selectman, Vicky Tesoro, who would like to say a few words to welcome everyone. You're muted.
There we go. So thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this important program. I'll just do a brief introduction. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third installment of Let's Talk Mental Health Trumbull. I want to thank all the town organizations who have been involved in planning these sessions: Trumbull PTA Council, Trumbull EMS, Mary J. Sherlock Counseling Center, Lakewood Trumbull YMCA, Confidant Health, My Friend Abby, Trumbull Community Television, the Progressive Institute, and TPOD, Trumbull's Prevention Partnerships. Once again, we are recording this session, and they will be made available on demand by Trumbull Community TV and on the TPOD website at www.tpod.org. Tonight's program is designed to help our community gain better knowledge and understanding about how we can be allies to our young people who identify as LGBTQ+. We know from student surveys administered by TPOD, Trumbull's Prevention Partnership, this school year, that our students who identify as LGBTQ+ were more likely than their peers to report feeling sad or hopeless, and also more likely to report that they use alcohol, marijuana, and nicotine. They were also less likely to feel that adults and fellow students value and care for them. It is our hope that tonight's program will be the first step in important conversations about how we, as a community, can support the mental health of our LGBTQ+ youth. I wish to welcome, and I'm pleased to welcome, Cadence Pentheny, Coordinator in Community and Corporate Learning at the Triangle Community Center. Triangle Community Center, or TCC as it's known, is Fairfield County's leading provider of programming and resources to nurture growth and connection within the LGBTQ community. Cadence, who uses they, them pronouns, is TCC's passionate coordinator of community and corporate learning and has a demonstrated commitment to supporting the LGBTQ community through training and education. Cadence holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies from Franklin and Marshall College and a graduate certificate in human sexuality through the University of Minnesota. Upon graduating, they served 2 years with the AmeriCorps program City Year, where they supported students in an under-resourced elementary school. Before joining the team at TCC, they worked as coordinator for LGBTQ+ programming and initiatives at the University of Mississippi, doing a wide variety of work involving intersectionality, diversity, equity, and education, especially around LGBTQ+ issues. Welcome, Cadence.
Hello, thank you. I never quite know what to do with my face when someone is reading my bio, but I appreciate it. Yeah, should we go ahead and jump in and get started? Awesome.
Yeah, just a few housekeeping items. If you have a question, you can pop it into the Q&A, and then at the end, Cadence will have an opportunity to answer those questions that we receive. And I'll give it to Cadence to take it away.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this important series that TPOD is putting on to talk about mental health, especially for our young folks in the community. And again, as Vicky mentioned, we know that our marginalized young folks are dealing with a lot of things, as are all of our young people, but it's important, I think, to take the time to talk about the unique and special issues, right, that are some of our specific young folks are dealing with, right? So I've really prepared today kind of a version of our LGBTQ+ 101 training, which is just what we call our foundational training when it comes to talking about LGBTQ+ identities and allyship. And I'm really passionate about the education side of things. things, because in my years having these conversations with people, I really just kind of have seen that once we know better, we do better, right? So once we know more about the experiences that folks are dealing with, we can really see how we can better support them. So I always want to take a minute and tell folks a little bit about Triangle, just because we are a resource here in our nearby community. So we are based in Norwalk, but we serve all of Fairfield County and really beyond, especially these days. Now getting to reach a lot of folks virtually. That's the one positive thing I'm holding on to, is sometimes it's easier for folks to log into events than it is to get someplace. So I'm holding on to that accessibility piece, at least, and all the difficulty of these 2.5, however long we've been doing this years. So yeah, I oversee our LGBTQ plus Training Institute. It's a big fancy title. It's just me. So I get to go around and lead the workshops for folks who are really looking to learn more about what it means to be LGBTQ plus. So obviously I end up doing a lot of schools, a lot of nonprofits and organizations. And again, I really just find that once we know better, we do better. And really the goal of the Training Institute is to make sure that we have the opportunity to discuss these things. Obviously, we do a lot when it comes to programming as well, from events to groups that meet weekly or monthly. We have groups for adults and youth. The vast majority of our groups are run by volunteers. Again, young people, especially our LGBTQ plus young people, means so much to them to get to be in community with kids who understand them also. So definitely suggest thinking about, again, we have family groups as well. So things that could be really supportive and helpful. We have a food pantry in our center that has, non-perishable food. We have winter coats, toiletries, socks, underwear, things like that, the basics that folks might need. So all of that's really important. And then we do have clinical services as well. So we have case management, we have counseling services. Case management really looks like any of the more difficult things that we all are trying to handle in our lives. And it can be really hard to do those things on your own, right? So it looks like helping folks find safe housing, helping folks with employment. We had a high school student in a couple weeks ago, needed help with her college financial aid documents, right? So we could help her with that process, right? Obviously, for our LGBTQ plus folks, there are some specific things they might need support with. Getting their name changed on, their birth certificates and official documents, getting gender designation changed. Let me tell you, they sure don't make those processes easy, right? So we can help folks with those processes. And again, we do have counseling services as well. So therapy, we have offices in our center, or we can do telehealth. And again, that's for families, that's for couples, that's for adults and young people. And all of our services, including clinical services, are free or low cost. So it's really important that we're able to offer all of these things to the community. So why are we here? I want to take a second. Let's actually think about these things, right? Kind of name them. I think we kind of have them on an unconscious level in our brains a lot of the time. Let's actually name these pieces of why are we actually here to have these kinds of conversations. Always making sure to set us up with intersectionality. What is that? What does that mean, right? Why is it important that we're always using that lens when being allies and support folks? Then we're going to spend some time actually breaking it all down. What are we talking about? We're talking about gender and sex and sexuality and attraction and all of these different pieces. Because I don't know about everybody else, but this is never anything anyone sat down and explained to me. It was just like, go figure it out. Do it right. And it's like, so let's actually spend some time thinking about these things, right? Touch on a couple key pieces of terminology, just a handful of words that I think we're hearing a lot more these days, but still might be unfamiliar. Spend some time talking about pronouns. What are they? Why are they so important? We see them discussed as this huge new thing that we're all doing. We've always used pronouns, but let's sit down and think about what we mean in this context. I always like to touch on coming out when we're thinking about how to support young people, because that's a lot of what they might be doing right now. And then I want to think about also allyship in school, but also beyond, right? How do we create supportive environments for our young folks? And before we get into it, right, I always like to set some kind of guidelines for thinking about just how we want to approach these conversations, right? So we are doing this webinar style, obviously, so less dialogue throughout, but I really want to make sure folks know that they can submit their questions. And also I want to set us up for a good mindset of how we can approach this, right? Safe spaces require brave spaces is a guideline I use for every training I ever lead, every conversation I ever facilitate, just because I find it is the most helpful way to do that, right? Safe space, common language we hear used all the time these days, right? We recognize that a safe space, right, is a place where we can feel relaxed, we can feel comfortable, feel like we can be fully ourselves. I always say, who needs safe spaces? Every human being in existence. They're just really important for all of us. I think a lot of the time we don't even have to name them. We just know what they are and what they feel like when we're in them. But for our time today, I like to have what we call a brave space. And what I mean by that is that learning is not always 100% easy or 100% comfortable a lot of the time. It may disrupt thoughts or ideas or things we've always just been taught. This is exactly how the world is. Maybe asking us to be more open-minded than that. Consider other people's experiences and trust and believe that those people are understanding and believing their experiences in these ways, and we need to see them for that as well. And not all of that is easy right away, but we recognize it as important, right? Again, assuming best intentions is a huge piece of brave space, right? We need these times for learning and for more open conversation and to ask those questions that we've always had. I promise you, in my years doing this, I have literally heard it all when it comes to questions. And I appreciate that because I know it means people are taking advantage of the time and space and they recognize this is their place to ask those questions, right? Again, that doesn't mean we don't take accountability, right? Once we know better, we need to do better. That's part of this process. It's not just about taking in the information and doing nothing with it, right? So taking accountability once we know better. Education is an ongoing process. I can tell you again, especially in the last couple of years, whenever I have conversations with folks who are parents or families or who are educators or anyone who works with youth in some way, everyone is always talking about how they feel like our youth are like up here and we're like in the middle here, right? They are so far ahead of us in so many ways, right? Have such different language than we have, right? I even feel like that sometimes, right? So it's recognizing we all have a lot to learn always, and it's going to be forever like that. There's a reason we call it best practices and not the rules. There are just the rules when we're talking about human beings. And again, questions encouraged. Please feel free to be sending them in throughout the chat or throughout the question and answer box as we go through, as things up. Feel free again as they come up to type them in so you don't forget them as we go through the training. Okay. Now this is basic, but I like to name it as just a conscious sentence we should all have in our brains when thinking about why we are here to have these conversations, right? Every young person is deserving of a school and home that is safe, that is affirming, and that is celebratory of their identity, right? And I pick those words, no, not arbitrarily, just kind of for key reasons. I kind of see them as different pieces of supporting a person. What comes with safe? I think of safe, that is like all the basic needs that a person has, right? If we're thinking about a young person, do they have a safe way to get to and from school? Right? Do they have the materials they need to be a good student? Whether that be books, technology, pencils, notebooks, things like that. Do they have meals that they can eat? They are not going to be able to be a good, healthy person if they are hungry. They're not going to be able to be a good student and concentrate in school if they are hungry, right? Do they have a roof over their head? Do they have a safe place to sleep, right? They're not going to be able to be a happy, healthy, functioning human if they don't have a safe place to sleep. So all of this in safety, I think of this as basic needs. And obviously, we know these are not a given for every person in our community. So we have to make sure that those things are met first. If we can get those needs met, affirming is kind of the next space that we move into. So can a young person walk into a space, whether that be school, a religious community, their home even, and really feel affirmed and seen for who they are? Are they called their correct name, the name that they tell people they want to go by? Are they, again, are they seen? Is their identity seen? Is their experiences seen as real and to be believed? Are they really being affirmed for what they're expressing? And the last kind of stage of this kind of idea is thinking about being celebratory. So not only are they recognized and just kind of respected, but are we really celebrating what they're bringing into the space? Are we seeing their differences and their experiences as truly valuable, right? Because they're bringing different perspectives, they're bringing different pieces of who they are, and, you know, really being an important piece of our community, right? Are their differences not just respected and recognized and like allowed, but are we really celebrating them, right? Looks like things like, you know, being able to celebrate like Black History Month or Pride Month or things like that in school, in the community, right? Really being able to be in spaces where people are excited that they're there. Unfortunately, we know this is not a linear process. Sometimes we make it to celebratory and then we realize basic needs aren't being met and we have to run back to safe, right? Because obviously basic needs like food, shelter, all of those things are need to be met first, right? But I think of these as like important processes when thinking about how to think about these situations and what it means to support a person, especially a young person. These are the heavy statistics. It's just really important that we are aware of these things, right? Our young people are struggling, and especially, again, our LGBTQ plus young people. COVID has not been good for anybody, but especially our young people. Again, if home is not a safe place for you and you are asked to stay home all of the time, you do not even get to go to outlets you might normally have, like school or like a club or a program that you're a part of, that is really, really, really hard. So Trevor Project data, this is national data. It's ages 13 to 24, self-reported, young folks report this. But as we mentioned, it is so important that we do not think of this as something that is not happening here in our community, because we know that it's not. We have the numbers to show that it's not. And numbers are important, but I also just believe people when they tell me what they're experiencing also, right? And I can tell you, in my time here in communities, I always hearing these stories, right? So even if we don't have the numbers, we need to believe what our young folks are telling us and what our people in general are telling us they're experiencing. Again, in Norwalk, we also had data from our Norwalk partnership, which is our prevention collaborative in Norwalk. And it looked like this, right? So we can't be thinking important for our LGBTQ plus young people to be affirmed, but guess what? It helps everybody to live in affirming and celebratory spaces. It's important for everyone to have those experiences. So not only does it support our LGBTQ plus young people, it also supports our LGBTQ plus parents and families and caregivers and just community members in general. It helps all of our folks who are supporting young people, right? It really helps everyone at the end of the day. Affirming and celebratory spaces are good for everybody, right? Again, even we're thinking about young folks, even there's so much research showing that even having diverse curriculum where they are learning all sorts of different things, not only is it good for their social emotional health, it even helps them academically to have those kinds of things in their environment and their curriculum. So again, it literally helps everybody to have safe and affirming spaces, even though we are concentrating on talking about our LGBTQ plus young people today. And again, if you're going to remember anything from today's training, from today's workshop, I hope you remember something like this. LGBTQ plus youth who had literally just one accepting adult in their life are 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt, right? The stakes are high. It's important that we are aware of this, right? That how much of an impact we can make literally just by being one person in a young person's life who sees them and affirms them for who they are. Intersectionality, big long word. Certainly not a word that I ever came across or heard until I was someone who was lucky enough to go to college and take social science classes and really set me on my trajectory. But I remember hearing about the concept for the first time and just being like so overwhelmed with just how important it felt and how much it seemed to make sense for like how we all interact with each other and how we are as people and the things that we need. So intersectionality is just the term we use to describe how even as just like single individual people, we all have dozens and dozens of different identities that make us who we are. And all of those identities at once impact our lived experiences. They impact how we see and interact with others, how others see and interact with us. We're all just a lot of things at once. Even the identity areas that we see represented on this slide, these are just common ones we talk about. We can keep adding dozens and dozens and dozens more until we can't even read it. We are just all a lot of things at once, right? So even though today we are focusing specifically on what it means to be LGBTQ+ and just gender and sexuality as identity areas in general, but especially if our goal is to be allies and to be support folks in young people's and in everyone's lives, it is so important that we are approaching that from an intersectional and holistic lens, right? So a little example. I think about times in my life where someone has really sat with me and provided like individualized support, where they've really listened to what I'm saying and said, based on all of these things I hear you expressing of what you're having issues with, here's what I think would be the most helpful for you. Here's kind of a plan. Here's what I've kind of thought through. Here's like resources and advice for you. Hopefully we've all had those kind of individualized holistic support experiences. We can immediately tell the difference between that kind of experience versus when someone just hands you something and says, this will work for you because it worked for the last person, right? Yep, I'm sure we've all had both experiences and you can immediately tell what's going on. Unfortunately, we know that kind of individualized, holistic, intersectional support tends to happen less often because people feel like it's more work and it feels like more work up front. But unless we are being intersectional with our allyship and support, it's really like putting a Band-Aid on a larger problem. It doesn't really fix anything because the person is not being seen for who they fully are. So it feels like more work up front to provide that intersectional support. But really, I think about it as you're creating more work for yourself in the long run. Because let's say you just hand someone something because it worked for the last person. They're going to have to come back to you in like a week and say, well, I'm still having issues with this other piece of this thing. Or like that didn't fix all of the issues that I was dealing with, right? We know the difference when we've had these experiences in our own lives. So it's so important that we think about it when we're providing support for the folks in our lives and who we're caring for. And that's just our allyship tip. Remembering that people are complex. We know that we ourselves as individuals are complex. So it's so important to see others that way, especially, especially when we're providing support. Okay. Here is our big slide. We are going to break this down piece by piece, so don't get overwhelmed just yet. We're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about each of these things and thinking about what they all mean for all of us. So I have my little diagram with my little people here. You can see they've kind of got some corresponding color symbols to our language and the things going with it. The middle, overarching concepts, and again, each of them is accompanied by more language, more kind of terms and labels along these spectrums or continuums. So we're going to go through piece by piece. You can see we'll start at the top with gender identity. You can see visually, I have it kind of represented in the little thought bubbles, little blue-green, and that the language coming with gender identity, female, woman, girl, non-binary, which I promise I'll talk about in a little bit, and then male, man, and boy. So gender or gender identity really just comes back to what your deeply personal internal sense of what your own gender is. It's all of the inside. You know what it is and what it feels like for you, right? It's your kind of emotional, cultural, social, internal self. It's just essential to your identity. You know what it is and what it feels like. For a lot of folks, they just may not have spent a lot of time thinking about this inside piece because their inside piece is always matched up with what other people assumed or assigned of them. That is not the case for everybody, which we'll continue to talk about. So it's the inside stuff. You know what it is and what it feels like for you. And I like to represent it visually in the little thought bubble because it's the inside. So guess what? It's not visible to other people. Nobody can look at you and know what your gender identity is. It is yours, it's on the inside, it is your personal feelings and thoughts about who you are when it comes to gender. The only way we would know what someone's gender identity is if they verbally express that in some way, if they had a term or a label to describe how they were feeling. Because that's what our language along our line spectrums or continuums is coming back to. So when I hear people describe themselves, self-describe themselves using language like female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, non-binary, gender non-conforming, agender, there's so many different terms that folks might be using. When I hear people describe themselves using language like that, what I know they're actually referring to is their gender identity, their sense of self when it comes to their gender. A huge piece I always like to point out here, not everybody wants a term or a label or finds that helpful. We're talking about a really deep feeling, a really deep sense of self and who you are. It can be really hard to find a word that fully encompasses all of those things that you feel. For some people, labels and terms and names feel like being boxed in. Doesn't feel helpful. It doesn't feel like it fully expresses them. Some people, that is not their goal, right? Obviously, some people do find terms and labels and names really, really helpful. It can be really empowering. Like, oh my gosh, there's a word for how I feel. This is really exciting. Can also be a way to build community, right? You can find other people and build community with people who also identify with the same term or label. So sometimes labels are really, really helpful for some folks. And for others, again, they are deeply unhelpful. So lots of different thoughts around that. But again, the important piece to remember about gender or gender identity, that is the inside, that is the deeply internal piece when it comes to your sense of self. Gender expression is our next piece. So you can see it's kind of accompanying with our yellow brackets that are encompassing our whole people. And the language going with gender expression is feminine, neutral, undefined, we can throw androgynous in there as well, and masculine. A little hint here, right? Gender identity is the inside piece. Gender expression is the outside piece. All of the more visible or physical things that we might be doing that express gender in some way, right? Clothing, I think, is the very first one I always hear as an example. Clothing is very gendered. Are you wearing skirts? Are you wearing dresses? Are you wearing pants? What are the colors and the shapes and the patterns of the things that you're wearing? Hair, how long is it? How short is it? How are you choosing to wear it? Whether or not you wear makeup, whether or not you paint or do your nails in some way, how you wear jewelry, what kind of jewelry you wear. Body language can be huge. How do you hold yourself, your mannerisms? How do you move through space and speak and interact with other people? I think even the roles that we take on in our families, in our workplaces, in any kind of social setting can be really gendered in a lot of different ways. The activities we're pushed towards or gravitate towards as kids, right? All of those things are super gendered in a lot of ways. So I think I've said gendered about 50 times now, but it's really important that we note nothing just naturally exists as masculine or feminine. We as human beings made up those categorizations. We have just been doing it for so long on such a deeply unconscious level, we do not even realize that we are doing it, but we are making it up as we go along. Made up does not mean arbitrary. It does not mean you can look at people and things and say, this is different from that, so it makes sense to put this here and to put that there. We largely do this with everything as humans, categorize things, make names for things. It's often a helpful process for us. It makes it easier for us to communicate, build structure, build culture, build community. But it's really, really difficult to do that with human beings, to categorize them in such strict ways, because we all got a lot of things going on. And it can be really hard to feel like you only have a certain set of things that you are allowed to do, right? That does not work for everybody, right? And often the people who express things that are outside of the norm do not have a good time, are not treated very well, right? Again, because gender expression is such a human created idea, what is masculine or feminine or undefined or neutral is just very human created. It can be super culturally relative depending what group we're a part of, what we've decided goes in what box, right? So let's say our group, our culture here has decided that women, feminine people wear skirts and dresses. Could be another culture in a different part of the world where men wear that kind of clothing. So it's super relative depending what group we're a part of, what we have put in what box, right? It also changes over time, very much so. I know I look back even in my own lifetime and see things that were once considered masculine are now feminine or vice versa. So it changes over time, even though we always see it represented as this is how it always has been. It's really not the case for almost everything, right? Think about, all of the women is every single one of them the absolute picture of femininity? What does that even mean, right? Because again, I think even just based on our own deeply individual backgrounds and experiences, we have different ideas of what it is to be masculine and what it is to be feminine, just individually, not even just as like a culture, right? Again, is every single man you know the absolute picture of masculinity? What does that even mean? The more deeply we think about it, right? Next piece, sex assigned at birth. Even if there's a word in the middle there that's unfamiliar and totally okay, because to many folks it is, you are still just as basic, thinking what you are is, you're right. What we assign sex based on literally just comes down to what does the genitalia of the baby look like when they are born. It's just as basic as that. 99.9% of the time, that is all we are basing it on. And it's still something we hear as just such common rhetoric. We hear it all of the time, every single day. There's just only 2 biological sexes. There's just only 2 kinds of anatomy people can be born with. That's just science. That's just fact. That's just the way the world is. Y'all are making stuff up. We hear it all of the time, every single day, in so many different situations. Why this is so commonly thought and something none of us are ever taught and is wild, because intersex folks have always existed and will always exist. There are many, many different ways to be intersex. There is a wide variety of characteristics, but someone who is intersex is any person who is born with sexual reproductive characteristics that do not fit in the strict box of being only male or only female, right? Sometimes it is things that can be seen right off the bat when a baby's born, right? And their external genitalia. Sometimes it's internal sexual or reproductive organs. Sometimes we're talking hormone levels. We're talking chromosomes. There are more than 2 sets of chromosomes people can be born with. There's even really fascinating work being done in neuroscience and looking at the brain and all of these different pieces. So when we're assigning sex at birth based literally just on what does the outside body look like, what does genitalia look like, it's really just a very incomplete picture, right? It's really just not encompassing a whole lot of things when it comes to what our sex actually is when we think about our physical bodies, right? Unfortunately, it is still a deeply normalized practice to perform corrective, and I say corrective in major air quotes, surgeries on intersex people to make their bodies look like they're supposed to look. America, every single day, right? It's still taught as what's best practice, and the vast majority of medical schools is what you are supposed to do if you have an intersex baby with these more visible characteristics externally. I think about it from a parent and family perspective. A medical professional tells you this is what's best for your child. People say yes to that because we are not taught about this, right? It's a deeply complicated thing. Again, identification is even on folks' minds because there is almost nowhere you can even get a birth certificate that says something other than male or female on it. So again, parents and families are thinking ahead to the future. They're like, my child will not have identification if I don't get this surgery for them. All of those different kinds of things. Again, oftentimes they are basing corrective surgery literally just on what would be the easiest to do surgically, right? And we do not know how someone's going to change and grow and develop and come into their body. And oftentimes intersex folks grow up because these surgeries are often performed on infants or very young children, and they could grow up feeling deeply uncomfortable and unsafe in their body, right? And that is really, really difficult thing. Intersex folks who do not have these many visible kind of external characteristics sometimes don't find out they're intersex until they're hitting puberty and are not developing in the same ways as their peers. Puberty, super not fun for anybody. Again, but imagine your body is doing these different things, right, than other people's are. That's really hard and a really traumatic experience, again, because often you are not treated well by the folks around you, even like support people who are supposed to support you, like medical professionals, right? Often a lot of still really complicated things, even when somebody's old enough to tell us what they might want, right? Still are not treated very well. Again, there is just vast diversity in our physical selves, just as there is in our mental, emotional, cultural selves. Look around any room. Is every single person look the same or have all of these same characteristics? Of course not. Even 2 people who are assigned female when we're thinking about all of the teeny little intricacies that make us up for who we are when it comes to our physical beings. Is every exact thing about two people who are assigned female going to be exactly the same? Of course not. Same with two folks who are assigned male. So it's so important that just as we are kind of coming into a world in which we're opening up the idea that gender is more than two things, it is so important that we open up the idea that sex is way more than just two things as well. Next, kind of moving a little bit away from the personal, kind of individual experiences and thinking about the ways we form attraction or connection to the folks around us potentially. I can tell you I've done whole trainings where we talk way more than just about sexual attraction or romantic attraction, because I firmly believe there's way more kinds of attraction we feel as human beings. But if it's just aesthetic attraction, what if you're just really into the way someone looks, but it doesn't go beyond that in any kind of way? Maybe many of us have felt that kind of attraction. I've heard great examples from people who are on teams, are athletes, or who work on teams in some way. There's just something that they described happens when you are just deeply connected to these other human beings. You're working towards this common goal. You feel like you don't even have to speak to connect. You're just on it. There's something you feel there. There's something that's happening there, right? That's not sexual or romantic necessarily, but it's a deep connection or attraction to these other human beings. We can build a whole bunch of models. And again, I've done whole trainings where all we talk about is the kinds of attraction we feel as human beings. But again, we focus on these two a lot socially and culturally in our world. Physical, sexual attraction. We generally can describe sexuality of what does that pattern look like for you typically? What kinds of people are you typically attracted to? Not everybody even has a typical, right, or a pattern when it comes to their feelings of attraction. Is also another thing that we do is that we assume that everybody must be interested in sex and who are they having sex with and how are they having sex with them, but also we're not allowed to talk about any of it ever, right? So that's not super, just not confusing or unhealthy for anyone to try to figure out, and we just make that so easy for everyone to be safe and healthy with, right? There are also so many people who are simply not interested, who really don't experience sexual attraction, who just experience a very little sexual attraction, or experience sexual attraction only when they build a more emotional or romantic bond first. Might be someone who identifies as asexual or being on the asexual spectrum. That is a completely normal experience. People have been writing about it and talking about it for hundreds and hundreds of years. We now just have a word to describe that experience of identity within the last 50 or 60 or so. Another interesting thing I like to name about attraction is that sometimes it's really based more on expression of the other person or people rather than their actual gender, right? So that's the reason why in the little, as my representation, I have a comma in between women and feminine people and men and masculine people, right? Because not all women are feminine and not all feminine people are women. And not all men are masculine, and not all masculine people are men. And again, we even just individually have our own completely just personal ideas of what it means to be masculine or feminine anyway. So especially if it's just like initial across the room attraction, maybe we're just attracted to femininity in general, not always women, right? Maybe we're just attracted to masculinity in general, not always men, right? Of course, we can be on all of the lines and feel connected or attracted to all sorts of different kinds of people, right? Emotional romantic attraction, again, for a lot of folks might really line up with the ways they experience or don't experience physical or sexual attraction, but not for everybody. If you ever just had a friend crush on someone, you think they're really cool, you want to hang out with them all the time, but you wouldn't necessarily want to be physically or sexually involved with them. That could be emotional or romantic attraction, and again is a much more common experience than we feel like we're allowed to talk about. Really way more normal than not to have that experience, right? Another huge thing we do culturally is that we assume that everyone must want a partner. Again, you can only ever have one, right? And that your partner, it has to feel like some huge, big, different, separate kind of love than everyone else you care about. You have to be in love with them versus love them. There's so many people who that's not their experience either. They don't want a partner. They don't feel like that is important to them in their life. They feel whole just as a person. Or there's people who have partners and are like, I love my partner very much, but it doesn't feel like some huge, big, separate, different kind of love to me than everyone else I care about. I also deeply love my family and my friends. that is also a very normal experience, even though we do not really see any representations of that in culture, barely ever, right? We do not see that. We are not taught that as the norm. Again, potentially you could have a pattern when it comes to the ways you feel emotional or romantic connection. Who are the kinds of folks that you typically feel the most easily emotionally connected to? Some folks have a pattern when it comes to that, right? So what I always like to point out, as we've broken down all of these individual pieces, there's almost none of us, regardless if we are LGBTQ plus or not, who can look at a breakdown like this and say, this matches with this, matches with this, matches. Not really what it means to be a person. Almost none of us are going to have that kind of directly aligned, all down the line experiences when it comes to all of these different pieces of ourselves. Even if we feel pretty aligned right now, have we always? Will we always? How could we ever know that, right? We don't. Even just thinking about our bodies literally just change as we age, right? All of these different things, hugely, hugely important, right? We recognize all of us are going to move and grow and change along spectrums as we have new experiences forever. That is what it means to be a person. Unfortunately, we just live in a world that decides to make a huge deal out of things, right? When we really don't have to, and it's really more normal than not. Couple key pieces of language I always like to pull out, just some words that we're hearing a lot more these days. Cisgender is one of those that's really important that we have, right? We also just might see the abbreviation cis, just the CIS as well, means the same thing. So if you're just a person who has always been like, you know, what I was assigned, you know, what was written on my birth certificate, what people have always told me it was or assumed that I was, feels fine, works for me, feels good. Never spent too much time fussed about it or worried about it or feeling like anybody got it wrong. Feels fine. You would just be someone who is cisgender. And I'll add a little bit more about why it's important we have a word for this as we go through some of these others. Next one, queer. I can tell you, sometimes when I've been in actual workshop settings, I've gotten to discussing this term, I see a visible reaction in folks. I see a flinch. People get nervous that this word is on a slide or that I have said it. That's a valid reaction, because many of us are probably well aware, for many years, queer was used as a slur. It was used in very violent and derogatory ways for quite a number of years. So it's really with the start of reclamation around the AIDS crisis, activism there, that again, we start to see this word be reclaimed. And that's a really powerful thing, right? So it's a way of taking it back and saying, nope, this is our word now. We use this for us. You do not have power over us anymore. You do not have power over this language anymore. That's super powerful. Right? And we see this kind of reclamation of language happen not with just the queer community, but with a lot of marginalized communities. It's just a really powerful thing to happen. Another huge reason, besides the reclamation aspect, that people gravitate towards the word queer is it does not have a strict definition. It can mean different things to different people. It really feels like it encompasses a whole lot of pieces of ourselves, right? It does not feel like being boxed in or feeling like you only get one way to describe yourself when everyone's asking you to describe yourself. Another huge reason, I think, why people gravitate towards the word queer. I find when I'm talking with young folks these days, this is the language that they are all using. So I think as a generation, they are just much more comfortable with fluidity and not having super strict definitions for things. So in general these days, context is what really matters when thinking about how and when we use this word, right? So I'm having a conversation with someone refers to the queer community, I'm generally not even gonna notice or bat an eye, right? Someone yells it at me on the street, I know we're not having a good time. So context is really important when thinking about how and when we use this word. Next one, LGBTQ+. I'm sure everyone has seen 50,000 different iterations of this with 13 more letters added. And oh my God, it gets really confusing and real complicated real quick. I've even had such important things pointed out to me, even just about accessibility and readability over the years. Someone said to me once, I'm dyslexic. This is a nightmare for me to try to read. I was like, that's super valid. I 100% hear that. Again, what if English is not your first language? Oh my God, what is going on here? How do I read this even? What is anyone talking about? So even literally just in terms of being able to read this, complicated, right? it is also super hard to make sure we are being inclusive as we possibly can be. Because in general, we do see this still used as an acronym where the letters, again, stand for specific identities, and the plus is meant to encompass anyone who doesn't identify with one of those letters. It's also super valid to be like, why everyone else get to be a letter you can see and I have to be in the plus with everybody else? Also super valid, right? So the answer that no one particularly likes, but really is a conclusion I've come to of having these conversations with folks, is I do not ever think we are going to have a perfect way to talk about everybody at once. Because we are talking about a very diverse group of people who not even necessarily are going to have that many things in common with one another all the time. And maybe that's not even our goal at the end of the day, to kind of lump everyone together. Maybe that is not going to end up being what's helpful, right? So I really think it's apt. We do not have a perfect way to talk about everybody at once, because maybe that's not even what we are going to want in the long run, right? In general, a model with a plus is a good model to use just because it's meant to be as inclusive as we can be. Next one, transgender. We also might just see the abbreviation trans as well, means the same thing. And this is a more expansive definition than probably many folks have seen or heard the way they've heard it used before. Because in the past, we've almost always see someone who is trans, always identified as someone who, let's say, was assigned female and is now male, or someone who was assigned male and is now female. Not every trans person's experience looks exactly like that, of a transition from one gender to another. There are way more many ways to experience gender than being trans than just those, right? Not every trans person desires to transition in some ways. And again, there is not just one way to transition, even though the only way we ever see represented in the media is like a surgical or gender affirmation procedure. Not every trans person is able to get that even, because let me tell you, we make it super difficult for people to get those procedures, right? But again, that's not even what every trans person desires. There's plenty of trans and gender nonconforming folks who feel comfortable and okay with their bodies, but they know they are trans and express that in other ways, right? So there's not even just one way to transition. So it's really important that we expand the definition of what it means to be trans, right? Just any person who identifies somehow differently than what they were assumed or what was assigned. So I want to connect this back to cisgender for a second, because I've had this question so often. Why do we need being cisgender? Well, if we have a term for being transgender, but we don't have a term for being cisgender, it's like saying that's just the default. That's just the normal. It is just the way normal, regular people are. We don't even need a word for it. It's so normal. And again, that is just always going to other what it means to not be cisgender, because we have a word for what that is, right? It also helps to replace a lot of deeply unhelpful language. How often do we hear people say things like, I'm a real man, I'm a normal man, I'm just a man, I'm a biological man? We hear this kind of language all of the time on the daily. Again, sometimes not even from people who are intending to be othering, intending to be transphobic. It's just normalized language. But even if that's not the intent, it is always going to have that impact. So if we replace all of that unhelpful and honestly just kind of incorrect, the more we think about it, right? Even just biological. We are all biological. So what does that even mean? The more we think about it, right? But if we replace all of that unhelpful and just transphobic language like real or just or normal or biological with cisgender, we're saying what we actually mean. It's just more correct, but we're also not othering what it means to be not cisgender, right? We are absolutely trying to get to a world in which we do not need qualifiers for anybody's experience. That is not the goal at the end of the day. But we live in a world in where that's not the case yet. What are our specific experiences and identities are going to have an impact on how we can live our lives. That is the world we live in right now. So until we can get to that world in which our specific identities are not going to have an impact anymore, it's just important that until we can get there, we have language to describe that, right? Because being cisgender has an impact on your experience. It just does. The same way being transgender does. We just don't see it that way or haven't been taught to see it that way because we've been taught that there's a default or a normal way to be. Next one. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. We are not there yet. Sorry. There it is. Last one, non-binary. Again, we saw this word on this other slide, but we live in a world, in a culture where these days we see gender and sex always identified as being a binary, where we have the girl box and we have the boy box, and that's it. There's so many people who that is not their experience. They're like, I exist somewhere out here. I hop between the boxes. It's one big box smashed together for me. There's just so many people who that's not their experience, again, and have always been having these experiences. We now just have a word to describe that in like the last 50 or 60 or so. Social norms and assumptions. Again, I've been alluding to these, but we live in a world in which we assume there's normal or default ways to be, and it really impacts all of us. Heteronormativity, just the overall normalization of being straight, the assumption that everyone we ever meet is straight, that it's just the normal way to be. Again, that everyone's relationships, their dynamics always look a certain way, right? That the representation, we see media, pop culture, straight folks, right? The vast majority of the time. Again, we have this idea of the gender and sex binary where there's just the two, there's only male and female, boy and girl, when again, that's not how everyone works in the world. And cisnormativity, same kind of idea and concept. Overall normalization of being cisgender, that's the default and the normal way to be, that we always get it right when we assign sex at birth. Again, that the representation we see in media, pop culture, cisgender folks. So I always joke that, you know, this is my academic background, right? This is what I've studied and continue to study. But when I'm talking to folks and doing my work, I am never using examples from the academic side of things. I am always using examples from lived experience. Because let me tell you, we all experience these things being reinforced on the daily. And I really found that these things are deeply reinforced often, especially so when we're working with young people, when we're working with younger kids even, especially. So many of the examples I find myself using come from my time teaching in elementary school, because we start this stuff real early. So, little example of heteronormativity. There was one day where I was supporting kindergarten recess. So, you know, they're really little, like 5 or so. And there was this little boy and this little girl playing together. I heard one of the other teachers who was out there say something like, "Oh, look, they're boyfriend and girlfriend." My radar immediately pinged. And I was like, oh no! Now, did this teacher mean anything wrong or cruel or negative or homophobic? Not hugely necessarily. I really don't think so. I kind of knew this teacher. She didn't really seem like that kind of person. She was kind of supportive and open to talking about these things, right? So honestly, again, even in my years having these conversations with that, I really find that that's what it's like the vast majority of the time. Even the people saying and doing these kinds of things would be supportive if either of these kids was not straight, right? I really find that that's the case a lot of the time. It's just deeply normalized language, even if that's not our intention. Unfortunately, even if it's not our intention, it still can have a deep impact, right? Again, we do not know what's going to impact one person and not impact another, right? I have conversations with my brothers now that we are all adults, and we'll be talking about something and I'll be like, do you remember when this happened? That was so messed up. I still think about that. And my brother will be like, no, I don't remember that at all. So we super don't know what's going to impact one person and not another, which is why we got to not do it to anybody, because we do not know, right? Again, I think we often think about situations like this one, right? Oh, that was just one little blip, one little thing that happened this one time. It's never going to be just one little thing that happened this one time. It's going to be a pattern that we all experience over and over and over throughout our entire lives. And it's really hard to not internalize that stuff, especially if you do not fit within people's expectations, right? So let's say this little girl could grow up hearing these kinds of things, again, from completely well-meaning people a lot of the time, but hearing these kinds of things said over and over to her entire life. She could grow up, you know, hearing, when are you going to have a boyfriend? Don't you think that boy is cute? You know, what boy is taking you to prom? And she could grow up thinking, I'm not interested in boys. I must be broken. Must be something wrong with me, because everyone has always told me this is the only way to be, right? that is really, really hard to not internalize that kind of stuff, right? If that is the only thing you are hearing, the only option you feel like you have, right, your entire life, right? Another huge thing is important to name. This stuff affects all of us, even if we are straight and cisgender. Every single one of us has had an experience where somebody told us we were doing something wrong when it came to the way we were expressing ourselves, and the ways we were forming connection with other people. Every single one of us, again, even if we're straight, even if we're cisgender, we've all been called things like a tomboy or a sissy or something worse. Probably didn't feel good. Probably made you stop doing the thing the way you were doing it, even if you felt happy and comfortable doing it that way before, right? Really, really hard for everybody. Another huge thing, it's not about saying that the norms can no longer work for you if they're a person who feels comfortable with them, right? Let's say we have a little boy. We got the little boy toy cars and dolls to play with. And the little boy decides he likes the cars best. He takes the cars with him everywhere. He plays with them all the time. Of course, that little boy should play with the toy cars. But the point is, he had the option to pick the dolls or something else. No one was going to make a big deal if he picked the dolls or make any meaning of it whatsoever, right? That's the point, is the options. And the vast majority of us do not get options even. So if the norms work for you, it's just about noticing the many, many people who they may not be working for and making sure those people also have safety and respect and recognition as well. Cis normativity affects people on the daily. Think about going to any space and having a bathroom that you can use, right? What are our options in the vast majority of spaces? Men's rooms and women's rooms. What if you are not either of those? What if you do not look like people think you should be supposed to look to enter those spaces? It can be really dangerous for you, right? Again, there are trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people who literally plan their entire days around knowing that they can have a space to use a bathroom. How do you get a job? How do you go to school? How do you do any of these things that other people can do without even thinking about them, right? That's hard. Filling out any form that requires you to put down your gender. Let me tell you, we are asked this in ridiculous places that do not need the information for any reason. I have been asked to put down my gender when I've been signing up to play mini golf before. Hello? Why would they need that information for any reason? It was an online form and I literally could not continue filling out the form until I picked a gender, right? To sign up to play mini golf. Ridiculous, right? Again, your options, it's like not existing, right? If you can't have anything like that. And again, why would they even need to ask in that specific context in the first place? But again, it's also like having blinders, right? If the norms work for you, right? That's another huge function of them, right? Is you're not supposed to be noticing the people who they're not working for unless you have someone close to you that tells you this. That's really how norms work in a lot of ways as well, is that there's just, you know, again, if the norms work for you, it's hard to notice the many, many folks who they might not be working for. And this is basic, but it's really important that we name it, right? Again, just one of those things that I like to make a conscious thought. There are no right or wrong ways to have an identity or to be a person, right? To be a human being who has experiences, right? Another thing another reason I like to name this is I think it can even happen from within our own communities and spaces. And it often is really unhelpful in that context as well, right? So there was one time I was having a conversation with a group of middle schoolers. So I think they were 7th, 8th graders. We were just talking about identity and experience in general. And one student, because we were talking about exclusion, one student brought up such a good example. She was like, I'm Colombian. I'm first generation American, and my entire life I have had other first generation students and even adults tell me that I'm not really Colombian because I don't speak Spanish. This was something she had been told her entire life by people her own age and adults, right? This was not something she chose for herself, right? She said, my parents didn't teach me Spanish when we moved over here because they thought it would make it easier for me to, you know, integrate into our new life and to American culture. I did not have a choice over whether I learned Spanish or not. You know, my parents didn't speak it to me really in home. And, you know, I didn't learn it in school until I got the option to take it in like middle school, right? But again, she was being excluded from communities she could have had a lot of support and things in common with, but because of this one thing she didn't have in common, she was being excluded. So that's another huge reason I think it's so important to name this, because it even happens even from within spaces where we really could be deeply connecting with people on other levels. And I pretty much can guess that the other people who told her that she wasn't allowed to be part of the group were people who had also been told that for some other reason, right? So we kind of do it as a self-protection method when it often is deeply not helpful, right? The more we think about it. Okay, pronouns. Because we see this talked about as some big new thing, I really do like to take it back to the beginning and the foundations. Back to elementary school, back to learning about parts of speech, or whenever we learned English, whenever that was for us. So starting from the very top. So if we remember, we learned that a pronoun is generally the smaller word. It takes the place of a noun, a person, a place, or a thing in a sentence. And it's a super effective language tool for us because it allows us to get across what we're talking about quicker or more effectively. And nobody's confused because we all understand that this smaller word replaced this larger word, right? We use pronouns literally every time we open our mouths. They are a huge part of our language. So what we're referring to in this context is the fact that there is gender tied to personal pronouns, the pronouns that take the place of people and other living things' names. Traditionally, again, we're all taught for the most part that we have he, him, his for the masculine and she, her, hers for the feminine, right? And those are our only two options in English. Again, we only have time to focus on English here, but there's so many different ways we can talk about how other languages are gendered. But English, primarily, it's just pronouns, right? So we're taught that these are our only two options when it comes to talking about single individual people. However, we have also always had they, them, and theirs. But again, if we're thinking back to elementary school or whenever we learned about pronouns, vast majority of us have had drilled into our brains that we are only allowed to use they and them when we are talking about more than one person. That is always, always, always plural. Why this is all drilled into our brains will forever baffle me, because you can look across English speech and writing for centuries, for hundreds upon hundreds of years, and see they and them being used as a single neutral, so neutral meaning no ties to gender, pronoun everywhere. Pick up any book and you will find it, right? Shakespeare is a common example people throw out of like historical, analysis of this. I also promise you, it is 100% in your everyday language, just on a very unconscious level. You do not realize you are doing it, but I promise you, you are already using it as a singular neutral pronoun every single day. If you think about a phrase like, oh, someone left their jacket over there, I'll call if I have a in our language, right? It has been added to all the dictionaries. It's been added to all of the writing guides, so it is not grammatically incorrect. Honestly, though, I am not worried about that. If someone is coming up to me and telling me that this is what they go by and this is what they need to hear to be recognized for who they are, why would I be worrying about the grammar when I could just be calling this person what they tell me they go by and affirming them in that, right? Also, another huge thing about language in general, it is supposed to change. We are human beings who use it. We needed to say what we needed to say. Language is here for us to use. We have always created new meaning of existing words or created new words entirely to say the things that we need to say. It is our tool as humans to do that with, right? We don't say thee and thou anymore either. If I say, I'm gonna Google it, basically everyone understands that means I'm going to look it up on the internet. But Google was not in our vocabulary 25 or however many years ago, right? Language is supposed to change. We needed to say what we needed to say. The one at the bottom might be making folks nervous. That's okay. These, zers is one example of a neopronoun. So neopronouns are pronouns that didn't already exist in English. Generally, someone created them because they felt like none of the others felt right or felt comfortable for them. A lot of neopronouns come out of internet culture. I have met folks who use neopronouns I have never heard before, mostly young folks. I have simply said, I have never heard those pronouns before. Would you just give me an example of how to use them? I want to know how to do it right. There is no one who will not appreciate that. I frequently have no idea what's going on, so I ask, right? Again, what do I call you is an okay question to ask. I think about it in the same way. If I meet someone whose name I don't know how to say, I will just say to that person, hey, would you say your name for me? I want to know how to say it right. It's just as simple as that. So we do not know what someone's pronouns are until they tell us, right? And this is really, really hard because we learned how to use pronouns at like a deeply unconscious level when we were like learning how to talk, right? It is deeply ingrained in our brains, for myself included, right? So, and again, we may just be a person who the pronouns people have always used to just refer to us by just naturally. Those have always felt fine for us. They've felt correct. They felt right. So it feels really weird to know that that's not the case for everybody because it's such a norm that's built into our language and the ways we communicate with one another. So the way that has been and continues to be the most helpful for me to disrupt this kind of thinking is to think about pronouns like a name. So if I walked into a room of people I'd never met before, would I look around that room and start pointing at everybody and telling them what their names were? No. Their names have nothing to do with what they look like or anything else about them. Their names could be some of billions. It could be one I've never heard before. Their name has nothing to do with anything else. I have no way of knowing that information until it's shared with me, right? So I think about pronouns in the same way. Personally, I think that takes pressure off. No one is asking me to guess or do any work on my own. I'm not expected to know anything until I'm told, right? I don't know what someone's name is until they tell me. I don't know what their pronouns are until they tell me either. Again, another thing, what you're called has nothing to do with what I think you should be called. Just like what I'm called should have nothing to do with what you think I should be called, right? In the same way as a name. If I went up to someone and I said, hey, my name's Cadence, it's nice to meet you. And they looked at me and they said, you don't look like a Cadence, you look like a Sally. I'm going to call you Sally. What? Hello? I sure hope that would never happen. Be pretty ridiculous, right? Nothing to do with what anyone else thinks, right? My only job is to refer to people by what they tell me they go by, right? My opinion does not mean anything around what someone else is called, right? So, how do we go about learning people's pronouns? It does not have to be huge and dramatic. We kind of can work it into the things we already do naturally. So a big thing that I do is I just introduce myself with my own pronouns, so I would say to somebody, hey, I'm Cadence. My pronouns are they and them. It's nice to meet you, right? Again, I can tell you as someone who uses pronouns people do not expect, do not see as the norm, I super notice when people do this first. It is so deeply meaningful to me, such a huge show of allyship, because I cannot even tell you how many times I've been in rooms and I am the only one who introduces myself with my pronouns. That can be scary, right? I'm lucky that most of the time when I'm meeting new folks these days, it's in situations where I'm facilitating conversations, so I do it as a teaching tool. But when I'm not in those spaces, sometimes I don't even feel safe or comfortable doing it if other people don't do it first. Because unfortunately, it can be a way of like outing yourself. So especially for young people, that's really scary to do, right? So if we can set an example and do it first, it is so meaningful. It is also not necessarily wrong or bad to ask. When you meet somebody, you would ask them their name because you want to know what to call them, right? So adding your pronouns to that is also okay. What's your name and pronouns? This is not an invasive question. It's not like going up to someone and saying, how do you identify? That's none of our business. But what do I call you is normal and okay and fine to ask as well. I've seen instructors do great ideas of passing out sheets at the beginning of the school year that say something on it like, what's your name? What are your pronouns? What do you want me to call you in front of other people? Right? Lots of great strategies around that. If I don't know someone's a more formal person, if I don't know if I need to go for a Mr., Miss, Mrs., Doctor, that could be 50 other things for 50 other reasons. So I'll say something like, hey, it's nice to meet you. What would you prefer I call you? And they can tell me whatever the situation is, right? I'm sure all of us have had an experience, we can relate to this, where someone's called us by the wrong name or mispronounced our name or called us sir or ma'am over the phone, and that's not who we are. It's weird, right? It's strange. It's like, oh, I don't know who we're talking to. That's not me. It feels strange. It feels confusing. Imagine being a person who has that happen to them on the daily, over and over, every single day, all of the time, just being referred to incorrectly, and that doesn't come back to them. That's hard. It's a really strange experience to have. I say often as a joke, and I say it as a joke, but if I didn't want to get misgendered, I wouldn't leave the house. not to have and say it to joke, but it's a heavy experience, right? To just go out into the world and not be referred to correctly. It weighs on you after a while to have that, as a constant experience, just to constantly not be referred to correctly for who you are. Because again, what we're called is literally just one of the most basic ways to feel seen and heard as a person. So I've just said what a super huge big deal it is. Oh my God, what if we make a mistake? The gender police are not going to come for us. It's going to be okay. We are human beings. Again, we have a lot of stuff in our brains that we didn't put there on purpose. So having a little, and it feels silly again, but having a little strategy in your brain ahead of time, how do I want to respond when I make a mistake, is so helpful. Helps you feel not caught up in the moment when it happens. So a little model I keep in my brain is the oops, ouch, I'm sorry. So first there's an oops, recognize that a mistake happened. Then an ouch, recognize harm was potentially caused by the mistake. And then an I'm sorry, just a brief, sincere apology. Now, no nos. I'm sure we have all gotten one of these. How many people have gotten, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry you feel that way. You know what I meant. Icky, 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 icky. Not helpful whatsoever. Again, did they mean to? No, that's the definition of an accident. But intent can be different than impact. So it's not helpful to not recognize that. You know what I meant? Well, it's not what you said. So it still has a different impact than what you intended. I'm sorry you feel that way. Okay, but we have to have some accountability here, or we don't do any good, and we don't do good for our relationship here to not recognize when we, unintentionally cause each other harm. So instead we respond with a sincere, brief apology. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. I'm going to practice and try to do better. Perfect. All we can do. Right? I like the little comic, shows what a mid-sentence correction looks like, right? So you're talking about someone, you're like, Jamie and their parents went to the movies last night. Just a simple mid-sentence correction. If we realize we did it later on, going up to the person after and saying something like, hey, I realized I misgendered you when I was talking earlier. I'm sorry, I'm working on that. Perfect. I also promise you, nobody wants you to make it a big, huge deal or for it to disrupt everything else going on. And oh my gosh, we're all freaking out. We feel bad. No, nobody wants that. Does not need to be a big, huge thing. Just a simple, sincere apology and correction, right? Another reason I like the little comic is the thank you. It is so hard not to go in defensive mode when someone points out we made a mistake. It's kind of a really human reaction, right? To just feel that way when someone calls us out or points that kind of thing out. I really try to remind myself that defensive mode is not helpful for me, because now I'm doing all of this thinking about me and how I feel. And it's also certainly not helpful to the people or the person who I just made the mistake towards. So if instead I respond with a thank you when I'm corrected, it's just way better for everybody, right? And it also helps to create this culture of empathetic accountability. Recognize we're all working on things. We're all trying to do better as we learn and how we want to treat people. So that really is helpful. And I will say modeling these kinds of things for young folks is incredible, because let me tell you, we do not get any good representation of what it means to gracefully accept a mistake, right, and apologize for it in our world. We really don't get any of what that looks like. So it's incredible to model these kinds of things for young people. I know I'm really where I am because I had people who modeled these things for me. So it's so important, right? Mistakes are going to happen. We're humans. So it's how we show we are working on it and trying our best to not do it again that really matters. And again, if we want to think about another reason why it's so important that we refer to people correctly, especially young people, this is another one that can have a huge impact. Because again, what we are called when it comes to names and pronouns is that basic. It is a way to feel seen and heard as a person, right? It is that important, right? If we're taking, again, anything else away from the conversation tonight, it's something like this. So as we wrap up, and before we get to questions, just a couple more concrete things to be thinking about in our day-to-day, right, of how we can support the folks around us, especially young folks. Normalizing pronouns, right? Again, putting them in places, our email signatures, our bios, websites, syllabi, Zoom handles, any of those things. The more we all do it, the easier it is for everybody to do it, especially people who do not get to live in a world in which they are referred to correctly. Even as an adult, I get emails from people who have their pronouns in their email signature. I automatically feel way safer and more comfortable communicating with somebody, right? So you can't underestimate what something like that means. Using gender inclusive language. You know, as someone who grew up in New England, you guys is deeply ingrained in my vocabulary. To me, it's a gender neutral term, right? But I've been told by other folks that it doesn't feel neutral to them. They don't even know I'm referring to them, right? It doesn't feel like I'm talking to them. So I try my best to replace it with other things. This is actually something I did when I was teaching in elementary school. I found I was really slipping into a lot of gendered language. I was saying boys and girls and you know, you guys a lot. So I told my students, they were in third grade, you know, they're like 8 and 9. And I said to them, hey, I'm trying not to say you guys and boys and girls anymore. You can call me out if I say it. 8-year-olds love calling you out when you make a mistake. So they really held me accountable. And it was a really fun collective thing for us to do. And again, I did not have to explain any more to them than, you know, not everyone feels seen by that. They got it immediately. Again, the kids are here and we're here, right? We're just trying to catch up with them a lot of the time. It was really cool. And again, they held me accountable. I also even noticed their language was changing when they were talking to one another. It was really cool to see that. Right? You know, using that kind of language, right? Again, when we're referring to young people's families, if we do not know who they live with, so that's another thing I started to do when I worked with students, right? If I was handing a piece of paperwork to go home, I would say something like, take this home to your grown-up, take this home to your adult, because I do not know who they live with, right? I'm not assuming mom or dad or parent even, right? They could live with a foster family, they could live with a different relative, so that's a much more inclusive way to support them as well. Making space for diverse expressions, again, really just comes back to recognizing we all look all sorts of different ways. We are all trying to find out what works for us in a world that does not make that easy for anybody, for any reason. So allowing people, especially young people, the space to try things out and to be comfortable in their bodies and in their worlds is so, so important, right? Being vocal and visible when it comes to allyship does not always look like marching down the street with a sign. We do not have the opportunity to do that every single day. Sometimes it is the things that feel small and subtle, but are going to make a huge difference for the people who are looking for them. Again, especially young people. Another thing I did when I worked in a school, I had a little rainbow sticker on my water bottle, and kids would come talk to me because they saw that. Right? It was a teeny little, not tiny, but it was like it's just a sticker on my water bottle, and kids were looking for that and looking for the support. So it's something as small as a sticker can mean that much, especially for a young person who's looking for that. Educating, confronting anti-LGBTQ plus language and behavior. Again, does not always look huge and dramatic. It does not always look like marching down the street with a sign or throwing your body in between people, starting a huge argument. It often doesn't look like that. Sometimes saying something as simple as stop. That we do not use, right? Again, even if you feel like you don't have all of the things to say, I think we worry about that as adults, especially supporting young people. We got to know all the right things exactly to say. Sometimes we don't, even as adults. So saying something as simple as stop, just in a firm, brief way, catches people's attention. Again, also, everybody, especially young people, listens way more to an explanation like they are, you know, humans versus because I said so, right? No one really listens to that. So being real with them, saying, hey, that language means this. It has this history. This is why we don't use it and why it's really hurtful. Being real with them, especially as they get middle school age and up, they are going to get it and also see that you are treating them as a person who you respect to understand this information. They will get it, right? It's really important to think about it that way. And lastly, updating forms, handbooks, policies, websites, literally anywhere you list resources or what you do or anything like that is so, so important if that's something that is within your purview. So often I'm working with groups or organizations and somebody will say something like, oh, we're welcoming to everybody. I'm like, that's great. I believe you. I don't know what that means. Be specific, be clear, say we have these resources, we have this here, you can find this here, here's a person you can go to for support. Make all of it so clear and easy to find. Another thing I think happens with resources a lot of the time, people don't express what they have. So if people don't know you have a resource, it's like not having it. So make it all really clear and easy to find if you are someone who is doing that kind of work, right? So that is the end of our little presentation. So I can see we have some questions rolling in.
Yeah, let me run through some of them for you. I have one here. First, thanks for hosting this wonderful welcoming event. This person would like to know what the best way to navigate when someone refuses to respect another individual's pronouns. I've been in this situation a few times with and without the individual present and unsure how to show up for them in a meaningful way. And I know you touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can go in a little more depth on advice in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. So a lot of the time what I go back to is I'm like, it's just incorrect. So when you are misgendering this person, you are not even referring to them even, right? It's just an incorrect way to refer to them, right? So let's say I'm talking about my mom, right, who does use she, her pronouns. But if I suddenly started talking about my mom and using he and him, everyone would be confused, right? Because that's not what my mom uses. Right. So it's really just even incorrect. And another huge thing I find myself doing is going back to the data, especially when I'm thinking about young people. There's data for adults too, but it is just, I go back to that of like, literally, you can improve someone's mental health, especially a young person, just by referring them correctly. It has that much of an impact on them as a human being. They stick around in our world if we refer to them correctly. So it is just that important. It is about basic respect. That's all it is, right? Again, same way as the name. I use the name example a lot. Would you refuse to use the name someone tells you they go by? Unfortunately, that can happen too, but less often. So I often use that as an example as well. Would I refuse to call someone by the name they tell me they go by?
Thank you for that. We have a question about intersex, and if you have any data on like what percentage of people might be reported or might identify as intersex.
Yeah, so because characteristics vary so widely, right? They can be things that are seen right when a baby's born, like externally, to things as small as hormone levels and chromosomes. Sometimes people don't even find out, right? There is just such diversity. We don't know for sure, but it's estimated. I forget the percentage number, but like the colloquial example is it's estimated there's as many intersex folks as there are in the world as redheaded people, right? Which is a fair number of folks. And again, there's just such a spectrum when it comes to sex and anatomy and biology, not even just when it comes to reproductive or sexual anatomy, that we really don't know. And I honestly think the science is fascinating, which is another reason why I wish we talked about it more, because it's just interesting.
Thank you. We have a question about whether Trumbull administrators and teachers have received training like this, and they also wanted to compliment you on your name because their daughter is also named Cadence. And I know Triangle did some training for some of our support staff, some of our social workers a few years ago, but you haven't done any other training in our schools at this point, have you? Or you
No,
have you?
No, not yet. So yeah, I would love to.
What kind of training have you done in schools? How would you normally approach that training?
Yeah, so it's a lot similar to this. Again, always approaching from that youth support perspective, looking especially at, again, what our young people are experiencing, why it's important we focus the time to think about these things, right? And again, basics, right? Because I think really that's what we feel like we need to talk about, especially again, folks working with young people, we really feel so far behind a lot of the time. And I think that makes people really nervous, right? They feel like their students are so far ahead, the young people are so far ahead, they're never going to catch up. So it's really, again, starting at those foundations and talking about all of these things. So for school staff, I really do a very similar training to the one we just did.
And a question for me, you work in a lot of different towns. What are there things that you see as like best practices for communities to do to be supportive of their LGBTQ, the Q positive youth and their mental health?
Yeah, believing that these are experiences that they have, because I think that is something that often I think gets mistranslated in a lot of different ways, right? We're like, oh, our LGBTQ plus young people are struggling. It's because they are LGBTQ plus. No, it is because of the ways they are being treated for literally just having an identity and experience that they have, right? So another thing, that's why the whole it's a choice is forever baffling to me. Why would anyone choose that experience when they see how difficult it is to exist that way in the world? Why would anyone make that a choice, right? When they see how harder that is for them. Again, right? Students of color have a really hard time, but do we tell them their ethnicity and race is a choice? No, and that's one thing they don't have to deal with, even though they are also dealing with racism and other things, right? Students with disabilities having a really hard time. Do we say their disability is a choice, right? And I'm not saying, right, we're relating back, but there's a lot of different experiences of folks who are marginalized who, right, we're all having different difficulties, and it's not helpful to look at it that way. So believing that these are their experiences is really, again, I think an essential point, and starting back at the foundations of these conversations.
And what are the, here's another question, is what are the opportunities for things like Pride Month and events that can be more powerful for our youth?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've noticed and what we're doing in Norwalk this year, and what I've seen a lot of places celebrating Pride do are essentially always making sure to like have family and young people time at events, right? So they'll have like, you know, a later night show where like usually, you know, like the college age folks stay and party, but I've seen almost every town or city who's putting on Pride always do like a family style event, usually like kind of during the daytime on a weekend. And I think I've seen every kind of community putting on Pride nearby here are doing something like that, right? Where they have like face painting and family time and, you know, drag queen story hour and just fun things like that for families as part of their event. So making families an essential part of Pride, as well as, you know, like the parades and all of the other stuff, right, that we always do, a really important thing that folks can do as well.
Great. Got another question here. Building on your example of you guys, are there some other examples of gender inclusive or exclusive language that you can share? I mean, I know I personally asked you if you knew a good gender neutral term for niece or nephew, and that was giving me a little trouble. So do you have other examples of words that we may be using that are inclusive or exclusive, or suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think besides you guys, folks, friends, y'all, you know, my family laughs at me for how much I say y'all, but that's what Mississippi gave me. It's a gender neutral, right? You know, students, if you're in school, you know, anything like that, right? Again, also using words like partner instead, you know, it feels more grown up for people, obviously. So often with young people, if I'm going to ask the question again, do I even need to be asking a question? Are they interested in any way, right? I think that's also another cultural thing we see changing. And I actually had someone bring up in a training the other day, someone was like, yeah, I realize I asked, you know, my niece and my nephew, do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? Maybe I don't even need to be asking them that, right? Maybe that's not important to them at all. Again, I was trying to be inclusive by including boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And saying both terms, but maybe it's not even a question I need to ask, right? Because why do we see partnership as such an important thing in the world, right? Again, also people develop at different ages. There could be someone at 15 who's super interested in having a partner and someone at 15 who's like, what? No, I'm not interested at all, right? So I think that's another really important thing as well.
Wonderful. I think that's kind of wraps up most of our questions.
I do see some comments though that I don't want to go into, but is it okay if I kind of
sure
a couple of thoughts? So I am seeing lots of talk in the Q&A about being intersex and pushing different agendas. My goal with trainings is always to introduce information, right? And to, right, how you choose to leave with that information is up to you. But our stakes are high, right? We are looking at the data of what our young people are experiencing, and refusing to believe that is not helpful for them, right? So I really just want to make that very clear. Intersex folks do not like to be seen as being people who are disordered. That is the way their bodies exist. It's not helpful to see them as having a disorder because that is not the case, right? Their bodies just exist that way. So it's, again, deeply unhelpful, right? And it's also just kind of arbitrary, right, to say that, right? Right, again, just we all exist in different ways when it comes to our bodies, right? And the stakes are high. Right. Also, I will also say, because there's a lot of incorrect propaganda around what trans kids are offered when it comes to gender affirming surgeries. No one is trying to perform major surgeries on children unless they're intersex, right? That happens. We don't see that as the same thing, right? But we sure are performing major surgeries on infants if they're intersex. So let me tell you, that is not us offered to trans kids. No one is trying to perform major surgeries on trans children. What is offered to trans children is a life-saving medication, generally colloquially referred to as puberty blocking. It literally just delays the impacts of, secondary sex characteristic or puberty. And let me tell you, kids who do not get this medication do not often make it because they are in such intense distress and pain because their body is doing these things that make them feel so entirely unsafe, right? Again, this just gives them more time until they're like 18, 19, an adult, to decide if they want to have any surgical procedures for gender affirmation. That is all that is offered to kids. No one, unless they're intersex, again, because we see that as okay, is performing major surgeries on children, right?
We've got one comment here, but just having had several relatives come out, one very late in life, and having taught a number of students who transitioned or came out, the more we know, especially teachers, the better for our children. And thanking you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. I think that about wraps it up. Is there anything else you want to address, Cadence, or?
No, I feel good, and I will be happy to provide more information on what it means to be intersex and also the support offered for trans children.
Wonderful. And as we said, this presentation has been recorded, and we'll stop recording in a second, but will be available for viewing on demand through Trumbull Community Television and through a YouTube video on TPOD's website. So I want to thank Cadence and Triangle Community Center for all of their wonderful work, helping us kind of navigate this, kind of changing world that a lot of us aren't as familiar with, but we're, very grateful for your expertise and your support as we try to support our kids. So thank you, Cadence. Thank you, attendees. And everybody have a good night.